What do you think will happen when one of the most popular figures on the planet rises from the dead? 15 years after Buck Owens' death, the truth about the man behind the music is finally coming to light. His children, long kept out of the spotlight, are now speaking up, confirming rumors that once quietly circled their father's name. What many suspected is now being revealed, reshaping the legacy of a man who lived under constant attention, yet carried secrets few understood. His story does not begin with fame or applause. It begins in poverty. Buck Owens was a child forced to grow up early, carrying the weight of survival long before anyone called his name from a stage. Hunger taught him lessons praise never could. That understanding shaped every decision he made later in life. Even when success finally arrived, he never forgot what it felt like to have nothing. The world remembers the music, the smile, the clean-cut image television loved. Behind that image stood a man who vowed never to feel powerless again. His ambition came from fear. His need for control came from survival. His legacy was forged from talent, drive, and a determination sharp enough to cut through anyone who believed they truly knew him. Those closest to him saw both sides early on. They saw a gifted musician who could turn a simple melody into a defining hit. They also saw a man who refused to share credit and never forgot a slight. From Bakersfield club nights to doors opening and slamming shut, this duality followed him everywhere. With every success, he grew more guarded, more suspicious of praise. Fame gave him attention, but never safety. He built that safety himself and kept it tightly locked. A major turning point came. Long before scandals or rivalries filled headlines, it arrived in the form of Bonnie Campbell. She entered his life when he needed stability, but their marriage revealed how quickly stability collapses under ambition. She gave birth to his son Buddy Allen and tried to hold the family together as Buck pushed harder toward greatness. The marriage ended in the early 1950s, quietly at first, but its consequences echoed for decades when Bonnie later married Merle Haggard. That connection formed a triangle that would shape country music history, blending rivalry, collaboration, resentment, and reluctant respect. After the divorce, Buck buried himself in music. He worked relentlessly, shaping what became known as the Bakersfield sound with precision and discipline. Fame did not arrive overnight, but once it did, it never loosened its grip. The Buckaroos formed around him, a group bound by innovation and strict standards. Excellence was not optional. No one understood him better than Don Rich. More than a bandmate, Don was the emotional core of the group, the one person who could challenge Buck without consequence. Their partnership defined an era. Don brought warmth where Buck carried sharp edges, and together they created something larger than ego or rivalry as success grew. Buck's personal life became increasingly complicated. Relationships came and went, marked by intense beginnings and distant endings. Friends noticed a pattern. He loved deeply, then withdrew, then tried to regain control whenever he sensed instability. Some described him as charming. Others found him difficult. Many recognized him as deeply complex. Far removed from the easygoing image audiences adored, television turned him into a household name. Behind the scenes, he controlled every detail, from arrangements to presentation. To viewers, it looked effortless. To those around him, it looked like a man who could not tolerate uncertainty. At the same time, his rivalry with Merle Haggard intensified. It was framed publicly as musical competition, but privately it was personal. Bakersfield became too small for two men carrying that much pride in history. Despite the tension, they needed each other. Reflections of a generation struggling to define itself at the height of his success. Buck had everything except the ability to predict the loss that would fracture his world. It did not come from scandal or rivalry. It came from the death of the one person who kept his balance intact. After that loss, nothing felt the same. Control, once his armor, could no longer seal the cracks. As his fame expanded, so did the pressure. Attention blurred into possession. Privacy vanished. Relationships fractured under scrutiny. Every attempt to build a personal life was consumed by public expectation. Emotional distance became his default defense. Silence replaced honesty. The strain followed him into each new relationship, none of which escaped the weight of unresolved conflict. Eventually, one relationship appeared to offer stability, but emotional differences surfaced quickly. Misunderstandings multiplied under constant observation. Every absence became a rumor. Every appearance alone fed speculation. Their private struggles became public property. The pressure escalated year by year until separation became unavoidable. Reshaping not just his personal life but his public identity, he retreated inward. Believing discipline could replace healing. Legal battles followed, especially over custody. Evaluations, court orders, and supervised interactions replaced trust. Though no criminal charges emerged from later investigations, the damage to his family had already taken root. He entered therapy, reduced drinking, and acknowledged patterns he had long ignored. Change came not from headlines, but from the realization that his relationship with his children depended on it. The legal process stretched on, draining emotionally and financially. Public appearances grew cautious. Interviews became restrained. Professionally, he turned to producing, gravitating toward stories of guilt, conflict, and fractured identity. His work reflected a man confronting his own contradictions. In the end, the most powerful judgment did not come from courts or media. It came from his children. As adults, their choices spoke clearly. One distanced himself entirely from his father's public identity. Another's private message revealed unresolved anger that never softened with time. One chose a new identity, leaving the family name behind. Another took legal steps to change her name entirely, offering no explanation beyond the act itself. The younger children remained protected, but their guarded interactions reflected years of strain shaped by court schedules and supervision. The legacy left behind was not simple. It was layered, complicated, and shaped as much by silence as by success. Buck Owens lived his life in full view of the world. Yet the most lasting truths about him were carried quietly by the people closest to him. Long after the music faded, the distance his children carried into adulthood became the quiet conclusion to a story the public never fully understood. There were no dramatic statements, no final interviews that resolved the questions surrounding his life. Instead, there was absence. An absence from family gatherings, from shared milestones, from the moments that usually soften old wounds with time. For a man who once controlled every detail of his world, that absence became the one thing he could never manage as years passed. The industry continued to celebrate his contributions. Tributes highlighted the innovation, the influence, the sound that reshaped country music forever. Documentaries praised his discipline. Awards honored his legacy. Yet none of those acknowledgments reached the private spaces where his family lived, with memories far more complicated than applause. Fame preserved the image. It did not repair the fractures left behind. Those who worked with him later in life noticed a quieter presence. The sharp edges softened, replaced by reflection rather than command. He spoke less about success and more about endurance. Friends described a man who finally understood that survival had shaped him more than talent ever did. He had spent decades building armor only to realize too late that protection had also created distance. In private moments, he reportedly expressed regret not for the career choices he made, but for the emotional cost they demanded. He had believed strength meant control, that vulnerability invited loss. The later years taught him that isolation carried its own price. By the time he recognized it, repairing those bonds required more time than life allowed. After his passing, the world froze him in his most polished form. Albums, reruns, and retrospectives kept the familiar smile alive. But the fuller story lived elsewhere, in conversations never recorded, in choices his children made quietly, in names they chose not to carry forward. That was where the real reckoning unfolded. His life became a reminder that success can coexist with unresolved pain. That influence does not guarantee understanding, and that legacies are shaped as much by what remains unsaid as by what is celebrated. Buck Owens left behind music that will outlive generations, but the human story beneath it remains far more complicated, written not in headlines, but in the silence that followed. That silence continued to grow louder with time. As new generations discovered his music without context, they inherited only the polished surface of his legacy. The upbeat tempos, the tight harmonies, the confident presence that once dominated television screens came disconnected from the private cost that followed him through every stage of life. History tends to simplify figures like him, compressing decades of contradictions into a handful of defining moments. But those who lived closest to him understood that the truth never fit neatly into celebration. Behind closed doors, his later years were marked by routine rather than spectacle. The urgency that once drove him forward softened into reflection. He spent more time alone, not out of bitterness, but out of habit. Control had been his language for so long that learning a new one felt unnatural. He had mastered command, not repair. The world around him kept moving, but his internal rhythm slowed as he replayed choices he could no longer revise. Friends who visited him during this period noticed how often conversations drifted toward the past. Not the triumphs, but the crossroads. He spoke about moments when a different response might have changed everything. He wondered aloud whether ambition had drowned out empathy, whether the walls he built to survive had eventually become the reason he stood alone. These reflections were not confessions meant for public redemption. They were quiet acknowledgments shared only with those who remained. The music industry, meanwhile, continued to frame his story through influence and innovation. Young artists cited him as foundational. Producers studied his sound. Bakersfield became synonymous with his name. Streets, venues, and institutions carried the imprint of his success. Each recognition added another layer to the monument built around him. Even as the man himself felt increasingly distant from the version being honored, the contradiction deepened after his death. Public memory crystallized him at his peak, freezing his image in a time when confidence masked complexity. Memorials spoke of brilliance, discipline, and vision. Rarely did they mention the cost of maintaining that vision or the emotional toll it extracted from those closest to him. Grief for his family did not arrive wrapped in nostalgia. It arrived tangled with unresolved feelings that no tribute could untangle. His children grew older in a world where his name still carried weight, even as they chose to distance themselves from it. Each of them processed the past differently. Some leaned into privacy, building lives deliberately disconnected from fame. Others carried anger they never fully released. Their silence was often misinterpreted as indifference, but it was closer to self-preservation. They understood that reopening old wounds for public consumption would not bring clarity, only noise. As the years passed, stories emerged in fragments. Not explosive revelations, but small confirmations that supported what many had suspected. Accounts from former band members, collaborators, and insiders painted a picture of a man who demanded loyalty because he feared abandonment, who enforced discipline because chaos had once nearly broken him. These stories did not destroy his legacy, but they complicated it. They reminded audiences that talent does not erase trauma, and success does not resolve it. The rivalry narratives softened with time as well. What once seemed like pure competition began to look more like parallel survival. Two men shaped by hardship, navigating an industry that rewarded toughness and punished vulnerability. Their clashes were not simply about music, but about identity, pride, and the need to be seen without appearing weak. In hindsight, their tension reflected the limits of a culture that offered little room for emotional honesty. In his final years, he reportedly found moments of peace not in accolades, but in routine acts of creation. Writing without expectation, playing without performance. Music returned to what it had been at the beginning, a tool for expression rather than control. Those moments did not erase the past, but they offered relief from its weight. For brief stretches, he was no longer managing an empire or defending a reputation. He was simply a man responding to sound. Death did not resolve the contradictions he left behind. It amplified them. Fans mourned a hero. Critics reassessed a complicated figure. Family members continued navigating their own relationships to a man the world believed it knew. The gap between public perception and private reality became the defining feature of his story. What emerged over time was not a villain, nor a saint, but a deeply human portrait. A man shaped by deprivation who never fully escaped it. A leader whose strength masked fear. A father whose presence loomed large even in absence. His life illustrated how unresolved trauma can echo through success, shaping behavior long after circumstances change, as conversations about legacy evolved. His story began to serve as a case study rather than a cautionary tale. It sparked discussions about the cost of fame, the emotional isolation that often accompanies control, and the generational impact of unaddressed pain. Younger artists looked at his career with admiration tempered by awareness. They studied not only what he built, but what it cost him to build it. The truth that surfaced years after his death did not dismantle his contributions. It reframed them. It allowed space for admiration without denial, respect without myth. It acknowledged that greatness can coexist with damage, and that understanding one does not require erasing the other. In the end, the question was never whether he deserved recognition. It was whether the full story could be told without reducing him to a symbol. The answer arrived slowly, through patience rather than spectacle. Through listening rather than judgment. Through the recognition that legacies are not owned by history alone, but shared by those who lived inside them. He remains a towering figure in music. But the man behind the sound now stands clearer than before. Not resurrected as a flawless icon, but remembered as a person who carried both brilliance and burden. And in that clarity, something unexpected happened. The story became more honest, more instructive, and ultimately more human than the legend ever allowed. With that honesty came a shift in how his life was discussed. The conversations no longer centered solely on what he achieved, but on how those achievements were sustained and what they demanded in return. The myth of effortless success gave way to a more uncomfortable reality that the same traits which fueled his rise also limited his capacity for closeness. Discipline became rigidity. Protection became isolation. Control became a substitute for trust. Those who revisited his interviews noticed details once overlooked. Moments when he deflected personal questions with humor. Pauses that lingered too long when family was mentioned. The careful way he spoke about loyalty, often framing it as a requirement rather than a bond. These were not revelations on their own, but together they formed a pattern that aligned with what his inner circle had known for years. The industry itself bore some responsibility. He came of age in a time when emotional endurance was mistaken for strength and vulnerability was treated as liability. Artists were rewarded for reliability, not reflection. The expectation was to perform, deliver, and endure without complaint. He excelled in that environment, but it never offered tools for emotional repair. What was praised publicly was rarely sustainable privately. As cultural conversations evolved, his story began to resonate differently. Younger audiences, raised in an era more open to discussing mental health and emotional complexity, approached his legacy with curiosity rather than blind admiration. They asked not only how he succeeded, but how he survived. They questioned the systems that celebrated output while ignoring well-being. In that sense, his life became part of a broader reckoning within creative industries. There were moments when reconciliation seemed possible, at least in theory. Time softened some edges. Distance dulled the intensity of old conflicts. But reconciliation requires more than time. It requires alignment, willingness, and shared language. For his children, healing did not necessarily mean reconnection. For some, it meant acceptance without proximity. For others, it meant defining identity on their own terms. Free from a legacy that felt heavier than comforting, the public often expects resolution where there is only endurance. They look for final conversations, symbolic gestures, or cinematic closure. Real life rarely offers that. What remained instead was coexistence with memory. Each person carried their own version of him, shaped by where they stood in relation to his power, his absence, or his expectations. His passing did not unlock secrets so much as confirm long-held truths. There was no single revelation that explained everything. The truth emerged gradually through alignment rather than exposure. Through the way stories overlapped without coordinating. Through consistent themes that appeared across decades and perspectives. It was not scandal that reshaped his image, but context in the end. His legacy settled into something quieter and more durable than myth. The music endured, not as nostalgia, but as craftsmanship. The influence remained not as dominance, but as foundation. And the man himself became a reference point for complexity, rather than perfection. What his life ultimately illustrated was not the danger of ambition, but the risk of never interrogating it. He proved that success can protect you from the world while distancing you from yourself. That strength, when left unexamined, can harden into solitude. And that the most enduring impact a person leaves is not always the one they intended. He rose from poverty to prominence, reshaped a genre, and commanded stages few ever reach. But the final chapter of his story was not written in lights or sound. It unfolded quietly, through choices made by others, through silence that spoke louder than applause, and through a legacy that continues to evolve as understanding deepens. That is where his story rests now. Not resurrected, not dismantled, but finally seen in full.